Okay, so let's conclude Chapter 6. So Chapter 6 is really where we turn our attention, our focus to government and the political process, right? So just as in Chapters 3 and 4 and 5, we looked at markets, and then we talked about the instances where markets have problems. We're doing the same thing here in Chapter 6, right? We're looking at the political process, we're looking at instances where it can work well, and then we're also looking at instances where it has problems, right? In these last few videos, we have focused on these problems of the political process, these problems in government, right? And so the issue with a lot of these problems we've worked through, like rent-seeking, cronyism, bootleggers and Baptists, where regulations favor the regulated industry, is that it allows these companies, these large politically connected companies, to avoid markets, to avoid competitions, right? So then these politically connected firms, they get an advantage over us, right? If I start a company, I'm not going to get a bailout. I'm not going to get a tax break, right? I'm not going to go be able to rent seek and get money from the federal government, right? But only large politically connected firms get these advantages, right? And so that's not fair, right? That's one of the reasons why we don't like this stuff when it happens, right? So we want, if we're going to use government to do particular things, we want it to be efficient. We don't want it to be inefficient. We don't want it to waste money, right? And so just like when we looked at markets in instances where they work well and where they don't work well, the same is true for government. There's instances where it does well, and those were those type 1 and type 3 types of programs, where you can align costs and benefits, right? Where you don't push costs out into the future with borrowing, right? And so there are examples of government programs that tend to be efficient. But there's a lot of examples of government programs where they're incredibly inefficient, right? And they're wasteful, right? And so that's why it's not about, I only want markets or I only want government. It's figuring out what's the best solution for some of these problems. Should we leave it to the market process, even though it might be a public goods issue or an externality, and maybe it's messy and not perfect, but maybe it's more efficient than government? Or is it the opposite, right? Like with roads and state parks and things like that, right? Where we usually have government do those things, and they tend to do them. They tend to do a pretty good job, right? So it's going to depend. We need to understand the incentives facing government, the instances that cause government to use resources wisely and be efficient, and the instances where it's inefficient. And we also have to understand the political process in voting, right? If we want to solve a problem and we turn it over to the political process, it could be the incentives in the political process are never going to give us a good outcome, right? And so we have to understand the incentives both in markets and in government so we can understand the best way to address a lot of these issues that we see in our economy today, okay? And so understanding public choice helps us understand why we see things happening in our world, right? We talked about why a lot of regulations favor the industry that's regulated, right? The SEC is the regulator of the financial services industry, and yet it largely favors the financial industry, right? Bernie Madoff, who was arrested for one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in the history of financial markets, served on an SEC ethics panel, right? So, and there's also issues of what we call the revolving door, right? People who work in the SEC switch jobs, they go work in a financial firm, right? The firm hires them so that they know how to navigate the regulations, right? And so a lot of these things go on, and we're aware of them, and we don't really like them, okay? So, but public choice helps us understand what's going on, helps us to understand the incentives, helps us to understand why some companies get bailouts and others do not. And lastly, I've got a joke here. Why are so many buildings in West Virginia named after Robert Byrd? You can go ahead and look that up online. Robert Byrd was a senator from West Virginia for a very long time. He has since passed away, but he was notorious in getting money for the state of West Virginia and then proceeding to have all the buildings that were built named after him. Like There are so many libraries and schools and buildings and office parks in West Virginia named after Senator Robert Byrd. So if you want to have some fun, go online and look up all the different buildings named after Senator Byrd, and you'll get a nice little laugh.